just so that you know. So in terms of the background for today, it's a partnership between Southern Queensland Landscapes and also myself and Connect Ag and Ecological Australia, Teresa Eyre. So I'll just do a little bit of background there. So yeah, as you would have seen, you would have seen the flyer and a little bit more of information around what is today about. It's helping you to assess biodiversity condition of assets that you've got on farm and hopefully identify some practical approaches to being able to objectively assess that. But we're going through a whole heap of the background today with Teresa. And so with today, we won't have questions during it, but you're certainly welcome in the chat to include that, and you're welcome at the end to also ask questions live. So we'd expect and hope that people would be able to have today where they also keep their camera down. Not everyone has amazing NBN connections, and I'm just mindful of bandwidth for some of our remote people who are accessing it today. So it's just ensuring that they can still get access to today. So I'll be monitoring the chat box as we go and be able to hopefully answer any questions, or if you've got any problems with accessing today, please let us know. But we also do have a feedback link. So in the chat box already, we've just put that little survey in there. We certainly would love for you to give us your thoughts and also what else might be useful leading on from today. So to kick off, I'd just like to hand over quickly to Isabel Murphy from Southern Queensland Landscapes, just a bit of an introduction to the program that's supporting today. Hand over to you, Izzy.
Hi everyone, my name's Isabella Murphy. I'm a project delivery officer in Toowoomba with Southern Queensland Landscapes. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the First Peoples of the region. I'm coming to you from Western Waka Waka country. At Southern Queensland Landscapes, we acknowledge, respect and learn from the First People of the 28 nations in the Southern Queensland Landscapes area and further afield. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and future, for they hold memories, traditions, culture, science, knowledge and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples across our nation. This webinar is being run through funding from the Australian Government's Regional Land Partnerships National Land Care Program. Southern Queensland Landscapes is working in partnership with these guys to improve the condition of our threatened natural grasslands and poplar box grassley woodland ecosystems. These areas have become quite restricted over time, and they're incredibly important biodiversity hotspots within our landscape that play a variety of functions. I'm really looking forward to learning from Teresa about the Biodiversity Condition Toolkit and how it can help us to make informed decisions about their management. Thank you, Rhonda, and thank you, Teresa. I'm looking forward to today. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Izzy. So just as a bit of a background today, it came out of some discussions that I'd had with SQ Landscapes and, dealing with some of the questions around this issue of biodiversity and biodiversity markets. So today isn't specifically about those aspects of markets, but it's recognising there's lots of conversations around co-benefits and that general whole movement towards how do we ensure we're doing and ticking a few different boxes when we are managing our landscapes. So in terms of introducing Teresa, I've had the pleasure of having worked with Teresa for a number of years on a few projects in Southwest Queensland. So it's lovely to have this chance to work with her today, but she's a recent recruit to Ecological Australia. So she's joining a team to actually help develop the next generation of ecologists and also do some fun projects, as she puts it. Before that, and how I've worked with her has been as principal ecologist with the Queensland Herbarium. And so within that work, she was doing a lot of in the paddock assessments, supporting field days and events, and certainly projects that I'd been involved with, and providing that ecological leadership in design and testing of and implementation of, let me get the right, ecological assessment and monitoring standards and frameworks used in Queensland. So things such as biocondition, that sort of terminology, but essentially it's just checking the heartbeat and checking the health of the landscape. So she's presented at a range of Queensland and Australian conferences and certainly leads her experience to industry programs like AgCare. And but she does have a love for things fluffy and scaly as well as cows, she said, and has been appointed to the inaugural Koala Technical Expert Advisory Group. So you didn't come to hear me, you came here to hear Teresa. So I'll hand over to you, Teresa.
Thank you, Rhonda, and welcome everybody. I don't know if any of you heard before, but I'm going to let you know that it's actually my birthday today. So you're all to be very kind audience, and I'm sure that you will be anyway. Now I'm going to, thank you, Daniel. I'm an actual year older. It's not worth celebrating, really. Okay, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. What can you see, Rhonda?
Just in presenter mode, Teresa. We can, yeah. So we've got.
It is ready to go.
It's in. We've got the PowerPoint, so not the slideshow.
Oh, not the slideshow. Okay, here we go. How's that?
Nearly there. One more. The other one, yeah. So,
now that.
Yeah, that's the one we want.
Yeah, it's because I swapped screens. Okay, so thanks to Rhonda and SQ Landscapes for inviting me to have a talk about something that the team and I have been working on for many years. It was an excellent series of projects where we were really able to advance our knowledge on the biodiversity in the Maranoa region, the Brigalow and Eastern Mulgalands. So just a quick overview of what we'll talk about today. Why do we need measures or metrics of biodiversity? How the Biodiversity Toolkit came to be. Quick overview of what's in there. A little bit of information on the biodiversity metrics that we designed and confidence levels. And this will be important if you ever want to apply this sort of thing in the paddock. A little look at whether these metrics actually work for biodiversity, and then finish off with looking at some of the special species that we know here in the Brigalow and Eastern Mulgalands. So why do we need metrics? I think, as Rhonda pointed out, it's becoming more and more of something that we need to be able to compare with other types of commodities. For so long, it's been difficult to be able to put a price on biodiversity. And I mean, let's face it, it still is. But these metrics have moving us a long way down the road of having an even playing field. So what they do for us is they measure biodiversity baselines and predict past, present and future impacts, allows us to assess opportunities and potential biodiversity gains or losses in a consistent manner. And we see this a lot in the offset frameworks that are around the place. We're able to quantify biodiversity in economic terms, which a lot of people like to be able to do. So it provides a value, or it can provide a value. And something that I'm particularly interested in is that these metrics support those market-driven environmental stewardship, biodiversity offsets, and carbon accounting co-benefits. As you can see, this is just a little diagram from the Queensland Land Restoration Fund, which has sort of been a national way forward on making sure that there's biodiversity co-benefits and other co-benefits as well attached to carbon accounting. So as your carbon asset grows over time, how does that impact on other co-benefits such as biodiversity? So just to start off with, about 15 years ago, we actually started on this journey, on the biodiversity metric journey. And it really all started off with the grazing land industry. And why was that? Well, grazing land management is one of the most extensive land uses in all of Australia. Like nearly half of the actual area of terrestrial Australia is covered by stock grazing. And that's particularly intense in Queensland, where 80% of our land area is under leases for grazing or freeholds. So what this said to the industry and to us as ecologists and biodiversity scientists is this can create an amazing opportunity for biodiversity stewardship and grazing land managers to demonstrate their biodiversity credentials for another income stream, potentially, hopefully. But the question was how we would do that. And this is where the toolkit came to be. So it was initially funded by Meat and Livestock Australia, but then there was, I was able to get funding from other sources like the Commonwealth government over time, just to keep the work going and to extend reach into different sort of ecological or ecosystem areas within, but still within that Maranoa region. So the aims of the first project was to develop a biodiversity measure of vegetation condition, which would match the grazing land management condition framework. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that, but it's also known as the ABCD framework. And that a lot of graziers have used that assessment in the past to just identify how their grazing land management is going for ongoing stock production. And so we were going to come from the biodiversity component side and try and lock that in with the grazing land management type framework. And then the fantastic thing was that they also funded us to test and validate whatever we came up with actual biodiversity data to show that, to prove that it worked or not. So we spent an intense time, a wonderful time out in the paddocks, as Wanda said, for a number of years. And we basically went to about 240 sites, which were surveyed at least 4 times across 28 different grazing properties over a 10 to 15 year period. And just as a little snapshot, what we found out there, and you sort of have to think this was about 10, 15 years ago, not too much was known about the grazing, the fauna and flora within the grazing land areas. So this was a fantastic opportunity to really add to our knowledge about that. As you can see, lots of fantastic species were found. We also installed about 960 pitfall buckets, and I'm just thinking today, it's my birthday. I don't know how the team would feel about it now, but we certainly would not want to be going back there and installing buckets again. I think we're getting all a bit too old. So over to the new generation. Let me know, any of the younger ecologists out there. We also started using cameras, and this was Dan Ferguson's baby. There's about 30,000 odd camera photos. Almost half of those had animals in them, such as brushies, koala, echidnas, and of course the ferals as well, which is all good information. So the toolkit, and this is what you'll find when you go to the MLA website. There's a series of toolkits that all comes under sub-kits that comes under the overarching biodiversity toolkits. Introduction, features, management tips, species profiles. But what we're going to focus just on today, due to time, is just the metric component, because that was the real crux of the whole project. And we did metrics and tested those specifically within the most extensive land types within our region, which is the brigalow galah scrubs, poplar box on alluvial plains, and the soft mulga on sand plains. So just to provide some background of the thinking process before we embarked upon designing a biodiversity metric is getting your principles and a conceptual framework in place. And there's a bunch of principles that are floating around the place, but these are the ones that I think are really important when you're designing a metric. Needs to be scientific and so therefore testable. Sensitive, obviously, to ecological change. Preferably, I think, not correlated with other metrics, because otherwise you're double stacking. Comparable over time and space and between ecosystems, and that can be the tricky thing to get your head around. Aggregatives, meaning that you can bolt it onto other systems. Affordable, consistent, educational is really important. particularly when we're working with people on the land who are out there all the time. They know a lot of stuff anyway, but they're so interested in the biodiversity side of things and would love to know how that all worked, particularly in their grazing land business. So being able to communicate that and be educational in our metric was also really important. Adaptable, that one's a tricky one, actually. It's more of a nice to have, it's hard to implement. And of course, verifiable, particularly these days where they can be substantiated by third parties in a market-based or market-driven system. And so just to give you a broad conceptual framework, and this is the rolling ball concept that's come from the grazing land management framework, which I really like. It's quite straightforward and simple. And the idea behind it is that if you're in a condition state of A or 1, if coming from the biodiversity side, we're calling them numerical, just so not to get confused with the ABCD framework. If you're in a condition state 1, the condition of your land can move between 1 and 2 quite reasonably without too much extra management. Between state 2 and 3, it gets a little bit harder. You've got to put in more effort, more money, more time to get it back up into 2, which is actually more productive. And I'm talking from a happy koala perspective as well. And what you really want to avoid if you're moving into this condition state is falling into condition state 4, where you don't even have koalas, not even tired, washed out ones. It's very difficult to push that ball back up into a more functional condition state. So the aim of the tool, the metric part of the toolkit, was to come up with a metric that actually reflected the functional capacity of ecosystems and species. So it's definitely from a biodiversity point of view. 4 components to the metric is a suite of vegetation condition attributes, which were based on a pressure state response framework. And these were constructed of direct or surrogate measures of species diversity. And the whole reason around using surrogates instead of actually going out and doing species was that affordability side of things. It's very expensive to do species surveys, as I'm sure a lot of you who are online completely understand and are aware of, let alone being able to identify them and understand their ecological place in the system. And then weighting those condition attributes so that they reflect the time for that particular attribute to be important in the ecological system. And I'm thinking here like large trees. It takes a really long time for them to form hollows and those other services that they provide so many of our biodiversity species. The other big component is creating benchmarks for each of those attributes and for each of the different land types or regional ecosystems, because all of our regional ecosystems on land types, as everyone is aware of, are ecologically quite different. So a big tree in mulga lands is nowhere near what you would find as a big tree in the poplar box as far as size goes. So you need to have those benchmarks to keep it all on a level playing field. And those benchmarks are used for as a comparison against the observed vegetation state. Then you need a standardized assessment framework. Anybody who's ever worked with me just knows I'm so boring about being standardized and systematic, because it's so important to be as systematic and standardized as you can, because that allows you to compare your data over space and time. And then a scoring system that provides that condition metric at the end, which is comparable between and within ecosystems over space and time. And the intent of that figure, that one value, is that the closer it is to 1 or 100 or the number 1, the more flora and fauna species that ecosystem will support relative to its type. So these are the attributes or the surrogates that we came up with, and I think everybody's probably pretty much aware of all these now. Shrub cover, large trees, plant species diversity, logs, perennial grass cover, a lack of weeds, like no exotic species. This is a benchmark, beautiful poplar box site out at Carnarvon Station too, in case you're wondering. Tree height and organic litter. But the other really, and tree cover. And the other really important thing is not just what's happening at the site for biodiversity, but what is happening in that landscape. So other attributes are like the size of the patch, how connected it is to other patches, what's in the surrounding landscape that might be impacting on biodiversity, and they all get scored as well. Now, this is a bit of a boring slide, but it's just to, I hope, communicate how the scoring system works. At the moment, by condition, we use an ordinal scoring, which is this stepped threshold type approach. We are moving away to that, to a non-linear continuous scoring, because it allows us to avoid thresholds, which are quite arbitrary, and also accounts for superabundance of a particular attribute. So, for example, if you've got a lot of, say, up in North Queensland and Cape York, where there's Melaleuca causing a bit of havoc for gold-shouldered parrot habitat, and sorry, there's a truck outside, then that's superabundance of Melaleuca that's coming in. It's all related to fire management, etc. But it's to ensure that you don't get a really high score for something that actually isn't probably ecologically what is right for that community. So this is how it looks like. This is these series of photos here is from Brigalow Blah, 11 Regional Ecosystem 1195, through the whole spectrum of condition states that we find out in the grazing land, from remnant in good best on offer condition, by condition score around 0.84, down to a buffel grass pasture, which is not, let's face it, it's not great for biodiversity. It's great for grazing land production though. And so this is where the management comes in, making those sort of decisions down the track. And so you can apply them. The aim was to apply the metric not just over space, but also over time. And we've done this as well out there. This is a poplar box site, was regrowth, biocondition score of 0.38. It got burnt in between the next time we went out to assess it 7 years later, maintained the same similar biocondition score, but the attributes changed. So the cover and height of the tree layout increased, and that was a good thing, especially from carbon point of view, but we lost some of those big fallen woody materials. So moving on to confidence levels, I don't know, I won't go into accounting for nature, but they're an amazing framework that's just getting a lot of traction now. And you can submit your metrics through to them, and they've got a very high level scientific committee that will look at the metric and assign it a level of either 1, which is high confidence, through to a level 3, which is a lower confidence. And it doesn't matter what your confidence is, because there's well, it does, it's fit for purpose. So you might want a gold standard marketing business, and that's where you might go for a level 1. But if you just want to show stewardship or progress in that way, or even just to get a feel for whether this whole marketing business is for you, then the level 3 might be right. And that's what we worked on in the Biodiversity Toolkit, was those 3 levels, from level 1, which is by condition, through to level 2, by condition light, we sort of refer to it, and then the quickie version, which is by condition at a glance, which I have to say, with our producers, our collaborating producers, they just wanted this level, which is completely fair enough. And they said, look, you're the experts, you go out and do 1 and 2. 3, yeah, we'll be able to do that if I can do it at the same time with the grazing land management type framework. And that is totally fair enough. And that's what we were trying to aim for, to make it as robust as possible, but not a really hard impost upon really, really busy people. So this is the level, confidence level 1. It's by condition. I won't go into detail about it, but you need to have a bunch of measuring tapes basically and put it all out, and not everybody loves doing that. Cows love our tapes, that was for sure. They messed around with a few of those. And you need to have some, quite high to moderate level ecological skills. This underpins a lot of the offset framework within Queensland, and also the level 1 under the Land Restoration Fund for vegetation condition. Now, don't get overwhelmed by everything that's on the screen here. I'm sorry, but this is basically the biocondition light metric, where we took the benchmarks for each of the different regional ecosystems, and this is an example for poplar box on alluvial plains, and we built those benchmarks into the scoring system. So it was a way to make sure that, or as best as we could, that this assessment procedure was still consistent and comparable across different regional ecosystem types. Still had to get out of the car, still needed to do a little bit of assessment, but it's certainly a lot quicker than the biocondition full-blown version. And then we designed this at-a-glance type metric, and Rhonda's going to freak out because she said, oh, don't put all of that on the screen, so please don't try to read all that. It was really just to show that how they look for the different ecosystem types. So it's basically goes to the 1, 2, 3, 4 type assessment, rather than an ordinal value between 0 and 1. It just goes straight to, yep, this is a rating 1. So it aligns with the ABCD type framework, where 1 is good and 4 is going to need to do a bit of work to get that into a more of a functional state for biodiversity. Looking at those a little bit more closely, again, these have those built-in benchmarks that Biocondition Light had. So these might look kind of simple, but they're actually quite hard to put together, because you need to have those benchmarks and need to be able to try and meaningfully build those into each of the attributes. So, for example, poplar box and brigalow are quite different ecosystems. For the poplar box, we're suggesting that you need at least 1 shrub species and 11 trees larger than 40 centimetre diameter, whereas to be in a rating 1, whereas for brigalow and bollards, quite different. It's a lot more diverse, and so the expectation for a boo site or best on offer site is that you're going to have a bit more diversity in your shrub layers. And again, this all comes back to having really decent benchmarks. So 4 shrub species as compared to 1 for the poplar box, and 11 trees, but at a smaller size, because you just naturally get brigalow communities are naturally smaller trees. So moving on to whether the metric worked, and this is where we pulled together all that data from the 240 sites across the 3 different ecosystems. And this is just a very quick correlation between the number of vertebrate species and the condition score. This is for brigalow. Pretty happy that it was working there throughout the different states, because you've got in the brigalow land types, you have such a spectrum of condition state. In the mulga, not as great. There's a lot of other things going on in the mulga landscapes, but it was still going in the trajectory that we're happy with. And if we ever went back there, I'd be looking at some other types of very pointy attributes to include for mulga systems. And the poplar box, pearl poplar box, is quite relatively low in its condition trajectory, but it was working quite well and as well. And again, that's because there's quite a lot of condition spectrum. And we can just look at that into the 1, 2, 3, 4 type classification as well. So moving on to the pictures, which is what we're all waiting for. Just what we found when pulling all this systematic and quantitative data together, some clear winners and losers in the condition race in the Maranoa and the Brigalow and Mulga landscapes. Fairy grass, cute name, cute looking thing, but not a great indicator of, well, it is a good indicator of a system in not very good condition. And Jericho wiregrass, crested pigeons, but more pointedly is my arch nemesis, and I know they're a native species, but noisy miners and yellow-throated miners. They cause this catch-22 sort of situation that they infiltrate into poorer condition communities, landscapes, but not Brigalow, because Brigalow is too dense for them. And then they bully out all the smaller woodland birds. They're actually, these noisy miners, you probably already know this, but noisy miners are actually listed as a threatening process now under the EPBC Act. House mice, and again, a catch-22 situation, brown snakes that love having more mice around, and so they increase, but there's also some relationships between more bare, cleared areas and water points, and having a few more brown snakes around, as well as lots of house mice, which they're happy with. So moving on to the losers of poor condition country, the decrease of species, or the indicators of good condition for biodiversity. So kangaroo grass, beautiful grass, brigalow grass, little woodland birds. I've just thrown in a few photos here, but there's a whole suite of them that, particularly in the brigalow communities and the mulga communities, that are thriving in the good condition areas, but we are losing them thanks a lot to noisy miners in the poor condition areas. Beautiful little dunarts, striped face, which is actually a vulnerable species not in Queensland, in New South Wales, and the common dunart, misnomer, it's not that common at all. Highly reliant on fallen woody material and burning regimes that are not too intense. Also not so much the stripe-faced dunart, but the common dunart doesn't like buffel grass very much. Planigales, again, highly reliant on a nice grassy cover and lots of wood, fallen woody material. They're so cute. Look at that one. Just think they're so cute. Always a joy to come across these little mammals. Don't come across them very often. Our tree geckos, such as the velvet gecko here, they're obviously very reliant on shrubs and trees because they're an arboreal species. The Yucca Skink. Now, the Yucca Skink's really interesting, and down here in this, I'm sitting on this massive tree, which was the home to like a colony of Yucca Skinks, and I think a colony of another species of Begonia as well, plus a whole bunch of other animals that we found. They, as you can see, this is a not in a primo reference state, condition state for the poplar box, but just leaving some of those fallen woody logs in the paddock just made such a massive difference to the amount of biodiversity that you were going to get in that paddock. Yeah, we loved that log. Now, just moving on to some decrease of species which are particularly close to my heart, and I just had to chuck them in. So we do get these out in the Brigalow country in the east, and not the greater glider so much, but the koala in eastern Mulgalands. Oh yeah, sorry. So that's the koala and the greater glider, and very reliant on trees and found in these riparian areas. And these species are now being just recently listed as endangered, and they would be prime species that you could create your own metric for, you know, bolt some things on from what's already out there and by condition or whatever, but some special extra attributes that you could include to take to a market and say, look, we're looking after greater gliders, or we're looking after koalas as well. And that's it. Here are just some resources that you might like to have a look at. The web, and I don't know, Rhonda might be sharing this later on with everybody. Oh, I should mention that those ecological condition profiles, so the at a glance type profiles, bad news is that because they are so heavily reliant on building in benchmarks, there isn't many available. But the good news is there's a lot that we did for Brisbane City Council. So for Southeast Queensland regional ecosystems, there's a bunch of them already available on the website. Land Restoration Fund, I've got lots of information, as does Accounting for Nature, and Ag Care, which is a framework that's been put together by AgForce, which also has a lot of interesting information as well. And just very quickly, I won't go through all this, but I really want a massive shout out to my team, Queensland Herbarium team, who just were in this with me all along the way. And of course, the grazing land producers, who were just not scared to have us on board, totally interested in what we were doing, and very just wonderful, generous people. Thank you, Rhonda and Cole, Peyton, and thanks Izzy and Holly and everyone else. And thank you, everyone, for listening on my birthday. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Teresa. I know how hard it can be when you're presenting and you can't see anyone's faces and you can't hear anything back. And but you need to know that that was great, and we all do definitely love the pictures and what we're doing. I think that there's so much experience that you bring, and that information around what you've included there just provides a little bit of that insight. I was I missed a step in the setup. I forgot to quickly ask a few poll questions. I'm just going to ask one of the audience. So it's while people are trying to think and get together some of their questions, I just wanted to put one poll up. And this was just about your experience. So if people can quickly just have a click and see how confident you would be currently being able to assess biodiversity conditions. So is it new for you? Do you have some skills but need some guidance? You're fairly confident, or an ecologist? It just helps us, have a think about where everyone's at in this space, because there's a few questions that I'd like to ask of Teresa that I think will be shaped by some of this as well. So I'll just give it a few more minutes while people do respond. Yeah.
Can I respond, or is that?
Oh, if you want to.
I love polls.
All right, I've just got 5 more people. If they can click a box, it just helps us work out where we're at with today. We don't know who's responds what, of course, but yeah. Okay. All right, so I'm just going to share the results for everyone there. So looks like we do have a lot of confidence, so that's great. So I hope that some of the things that Teresa was putting through for everyone was an indication of, you know, what's out there, and certainly, you know, ways of doing it in a rigorous way. So in terms of some questions, we do have a question in the chat from Keith. Other than happy birthday, you share a birthday with us as well. Is there any, with the MLA Biodiversity Toolkit, is there any ways that this will be introduced into other states at this point? Are you aware of anything that's happening there?
No, I am not aware.
Yeah.
Sorry, Keith. Yeah, it was, there was a lot of people, and I think it was Rhonda, even yourself, even though you knew we were out there doing it, there wasn't much of a fanfare with the release, I think, and that was because there was a bit of personnel change and maybe, but I think now with a lot of the markets being emerging, that there is a renewed interest in it as well.
Well, so there's a few other things in there too. Like I've just shared in the chat a link to where you can actually find the toolkit on the MLA website. But in your mind, Teresa, is the package as it sits on the website now, if people were to go and download that, what's the extra bits and pieces that they would need to do as part of it, in terms of their own preparation to go forth? Like, would they need to, have some maps, bits and pieces? How do they get ready?
Yeah, and this is where AgCare might be useful, because it does a lot of that front preparation. It will helps facilitate that. Maybe SQ Landscapes can help there as well. But basically, if you've got a map, then you're good to go. Yeah. as a good starting point. But also having an objective of what your objective is. So if it's for carbon accounting, you need to have that factored in. If it's more from a biodiversity stewardship type of approach, then that will mean that you can use a different type of an assessment technique, and you might be able to do it yourself, for example. So I think as with any assessment, you just need to make sure you got your objectives clear and ready to go.
So the question here is, how closely do you think the biodiversity classes align with the ABCD for GLM?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we did a lot of analysis on that, and I've got some slides which I didn't put in, but basically in modified landscapes, as you can imagine, a 1 for grazing land management, or an A for grazing land management, does not align with a 1 for biodiversity. And like I did show that bufflegrass pasture, that's a prime example where it's really good for production, but it's terrible, let's face it, for biodiversity. However, in areas where, and we had Cole Payton out with us doing all the grazing land management assessments, and he's like the guru. And when we were in sort of the mulga lands where there isn't as much clearing, and bufflegrass can't really take on out there very well anyway, so there's not much exotic pasture either. So it's much less modified, and there was a much better alignment between a biodiversity condition being good for biodiversity and being good for grazing. It's really once you get into those cleared areas that you get that divergent happening.
Yeah. So.
But you can improve on the condition, and this was our main messaging, you can improve on the condition of those paddocks by just leaving a couple of trees, and makes a massive difference, or some full-on woody material, and having it managed well for grazing land condition has a lot of positive flow-on effects for biodiversity for that particular condition state. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I hope that answers your questions, Alison. We've got also just a question. You mentioned you'd like to go back to mulga lands, and measure more pointy metrics. Do you have any, a bit more big detail about what that would be and how you'd measure them?
Yeah, I think it would come down to species. So having some indicator species, particularly in the grass layer, because there's a lot of ground foraging birds. Mulga lands is great for birds, I've got to say. It's just, people probably may not realise that, but it's just a very rich species diversity out there in good condition mulga lands. Anyway, there's a suite of ground foraging species that love it when there's a bit of grass around, of course. But when you've got those Eremophilus coming through, like Bowmanii and Gillesii, then it stuffs around with the amount of cover of grass. And, it's not just a dilemma for biodiversity, it's a dilemma for grazing land managers as well. So those sort of things can act as quite useful indicators, I think, of a particular condition state.
Thanks, Teresa. So another question here is also about the ability of some of this to be used in rangeland systems more broadly. So do you think that there's more of a transferability across latitudes for some of this?
Yeah, absolutely. You can take it anywhere as long as you've got your benchmarks sorted. And that's probably the most limiting factor, because I can see Annie Kelly's online, but she's the benchmark coordinator through the Queensland Herbarium, and it's not a trivial job, particularly how we do it in Queensland, which is where we go out and actually measure, find best on offer land ecosystems, and then measure them so that we have quantitative values that can be used as benchmarks. And you can't just have one benchmark, particularly for those really extensive regional ecosystems. You need to have a range of them, because you do get natural variation across the natural range of a particular regional ecosystem, and we need to be able to try and capture that as best we can, so that you're not coming up with rubbishy benchmarks, and then the whole system is not going to be working how it should.
So within this too, just a general question that's there is, how important is the ability for you to be able to identify flora versus fauna in the assessment?
Don't need to be able to identify fauna.
Okay.
It does really help if you can identify. You don't have to identify it to species, but to be able to see the difference between certain species helps a lot. We found with our grazing land management producers, they're all over the grasses anyway, because that's part of their business. So that's worked quite well for them, and that's in the grazing land management at the ABCD framework as well. Is those indicator species, those 3P, those perennial, palatable and productive species. And they've been identified largely for most of Queensland, what those species are. I think there's land type profiles that can be accessed through DAF, and they identify what some of those really key species are. So it does help to know what you're looking at as far as flora goes. But with fauna, unless you want to get into looking for some of those the birds, they're real key indicator species. I think if you've got some of those little small-bodied woodland birds around, then you should be feeling pretty happy. And no noisy miners, preferably.
Yeah, so if in the process, if producers are working through and trying to assess this, their ability to record some of those observations over time could be quite useful to be able to build that catalogue, is what you're suggesting there too.
Yeah, and that's what we tried to do in the toolkit as well. But there's so many species that we just focused on doing profiles for some of those real key indicator species. And this is just for one region. It'd be great if we were able to extend our knowledge of key increaser and decreaser species, not just from a flora point of view or a grass 3P point of view, but from fauna as well, and have everybody out there looking after them.
Thanks. So also, just probably in the last closing questions here, are you aware of any examples that people are using a biodiversity condition score for their marketing purposes?
Yes, well, there is, and it was in the acknowledgements, there is, I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but there's the agricultural or the biodiversity stewardship program that's being run out from ANU.
I'll put it up on my screen.
Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. Very good colleague, dear friend of mine, Don Butler, who was behind the Land Restoration Fund as well. He's a key person in all this. They have pilot areas that are being rolled out across the country. One's in the Burnett Mary, I think, in Queensland.
Yeah.
And that's where they have been testing metrics in a biodiversity space. There's also a project that's being run through DAV, and Dr. Hayley McMillan is the key resource, the project leader there, and that's a Meat and Livestock Australia project as well. And it's called Methods to Market, and the whole premise of that particular project is to try and find markets for grazing land families that they can use, and so that, you know, whether it's carbon or for biodiversity or whatever. And so we've been collaborating with Hayley on that project, and very keen to see the outcomes of that project.
So yeah.
So I guess sorry, Rhonda, I guess the answer to that question is that it's all starting to happen. and AFN have also been accounting for nature. They also have been trialling work on Gundakum Station, using their different types of metrics as well. So yeah, I think it's a watch this space and have your metric ready to go.
Yeah,
just in case.
Well, I do just before people go, I really would love their feedback. So one of the questions that we do have in the feedback survey is about following up into this environmental market space. So obviously the Queensland Government's Land Restoration Fund has provided a great step forward for the Queensland market to be able to try and evolve, where essentially the government is investing in biodiverse carbon, looking at things that deliver some co-benefits, as the term, and there's ways of getting information support. So I'm not sure if the rebate is coming out this year or not, but certainly the last 2 years they've had a program that supported producers to be able to get individual expertise and assessment on some of the biodiversity carbon social co-benefits that could be on their property. So getting that assessment and signing up for that rebate is if it becomes available again this next year, would be great. Certainly the Ag Steward program is something that's evolving, and having that independent platform around it is important, and not always is it about being linked with carbon, but certainly in the feedback we'd love to hear if there are particular things that people would like in this general environmental market space, and we'll look forward to try and be able to put things together. But we're really grateful. Thanks again to SQ Landscapes and to Teresa for today. I hope you've all got something out of it, and yeah, we'll make sure we send an email through with a link, but please fill out the feedback so we can look at this and things you particularly got out of day that we can follow up with. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rhonda.